hearing people say, I feel underutilized with my skills. My favorite story is a friend of mine who works at Google, and she's like, I met with my pastor. Pastors are amazing, right? And she's like, my pastor finds out I work at Google. I was like, oh, that's good. I think that's good, right? She's like, well, then he's like, oh, you work at Google. Can you run PowerPoint on Sunday? Like, that would be really epic for us. And her feedback was, I'll do that. Like, I want to serve my church. I love my church. I want to serve my church. But it just feels like I'm deploying a product for 1 billion people tomorrow is kind of the mentality. Her comment was hilarious. She said, could I build a PowerPoint that runs all of them across the city on Sunday? Like, could we automate?
Well, James Kelly, a very special welcome to the Soars podcast. It is amazing to have you on, not only because you're a longtime friend, but also because how God is using you and how God's using FaithTech is amazing. So a very special welcome to the show.
Let's do it. Let's keep doing what we already do, which is when we sit down, we just talk about important things related to Jesus. Now we're just recording what we've been doing for years, which is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. It's absolutely true, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
I love you, man. I'm so glad you're doing this too.
I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah. I mean, genuinely, I've been tracking along, and I really think something special is going on in Canada and even beyond. I mean, with FaithTech, we get to see movements of God happening all over the world. And I really think the Canadian church in particular is ready to embrace a unexplainable work of the Holy Spirit. And I think in pockets, we're already seeing some special stuff happen. So yeah, man, excited to talk a little bit about my small sliver corner of what God has given us insight into what he's doing.
Well, why don't you start there then with some of these insights, the pockets of where you're seeing God at work. We'll probably get to a little bit about the origin story of the organization, but yeah, where are you seeing God at work, the pockets, and the corners that you see?
Yeah, so my vantage on this is FaithTech broadly. It's a tech community for Jesus. So it is a people that are passionate about Jesus, passionate about technology, building it, creating it, thinking about it. And when it started, you're kind of like, oh man, we are a bunch of nerds that, where do we fit in this whole global church thing? And when it started, you're kind of like, okay, wow, in my city, there's a few of us. That's pretty cool. Now, right, like 8 years later, we're like, I'm just seeing from a technology world standpoint, a shift really taking place. So even in the last couple months, you've had New York Times, Vanity Fair, and Wired all come out with major, major articles talking about how the shift in Silicon Valley to a openness about talking about faith is taking place. Now, I think that's amazing that those articles are being written because it's tied to really big names. And I know a bunch of them they're amazing folks that really love Jesus, many of them. But I would say it's been going on for years, but as like an underground movement of people that are saying, look, God's gifted me with a unique ability. And it may not be what a local church typically looks to in preaching or leading worship, but I have this unique ability to create tools that are shaping society, or I have a unique skill set that God's given me. And I think we're just seeing that community of people that see that unique skill set God's given them to really step up and start building. And there's been faith and work type of movements come and go over many years, over the last several decades. What I get to see and what I get to be a part of right now is it feels like there's an activation piece to it. It's not just, hey, at work, like if you work at Google, I want you to do like a prayer meeting. I still think that's great. But what we're seeing is this shift towards, well, no, actually, how does it actually change how you build entirely at work and change the company and still pray for and still evangelize and still live out this radical faith in this place, but like have that place as a calling in a very clear way. So that's at a global scale. I think on a Canadian side, I think there's honestly hearing the stories that you get to highlight of like radical church planters. There's a really cool organization called Missional Labs. Friends of mine run this group. Stephen Mulder, friend of mine in Vancouver, and another guy, Tyler Preeb in New York. They started this thing where they're trying to train the next generation of small A apostles, essentially, and equip them to build and create new movements of God. And they do it in this structured, like accelerator program way.
Hmm.
And seeing that stuff starting to get formed too around like inspiring the next generation of innovators and
Right.
risk takers. I feel like that next generation is just ready to build and create new things that we've never seen before, and in a way that that whole kind of ecosystem of builders and creators are ready to support that. So
Mm-hmm.
that's been pretty cool.
Mm-hmm. I feel like there's probably some people listening that are going, wow, this is like this is an interesting world that this guy James is in. So for those that are not familiar with you and your story, why are you involved in this tech world? How did you get involved?
A good
In
question.
essence, kind of what's the background, the story of James, and then this thing called FaithTech.
I mean, truthfully, I don't know. I don't know what is God doing. Like really, my background doesn't make a whole lot of sense for why I'm doing this thing in technology. Going back, I grew up just outside Toronto. My parents came to faith when I was really young. So like, and came from very non-faith, difficult backgrounds, and Jesus just like radically changed their life. And then, so I grew up in a family trying to figure it out, but with parents like really pursuing Jesus, and so I grew up in that context. I went and did like a business degree and Masters of Divinity, and you're like, oh, I'm on the pastoral path, like in a local church pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Help plant a church, go back into business to help that church plant get started. And then suddenly here in Waterloo, which is the home of BlackBerry, which is a really cool story of God because in its in its collapse, all these brilliant people from all over the world stayed in Kitchener Waterloo and then started building all these tech companies. And so I'm in the midst of all this, meet all these tech people, and it's really wasn't so much about the technology, and I'd say it still isn't.
Mm-hmm.
But hearing people say things like, I feel underutilized with
Mm-hmm.
my skills. Like my favorite story is a friend of mine who works at Google, and she's like, I met with my pastor. And I was like, oh, I mean, pastors are amazing, right? And she's like, my pastor finds out I work at Google. I was like, oh, that's good. I think that's good, right? She's like, well, then he's like, oh, you work at Google. Can you run PowerPoint on Sunday? Like that would be really epic for us.
Mm-hmm.
And her feedback was just like, I'll do that. Like I want to serve my church. I love my church. I want to serve my church. But it just feels like I'm deploying a product for 1 billion people tomorrow is
Yeah,
kind of the
yeah. She could
mentality.
code PowerPoint.
Her comment was hilarious. She said, could I build a PowerPoint that runs all of them across the city on Sunday? Like, could we automate? And sometimes that's not helpful, but and I think, yeah, and another guy too from Chicago summarized it well. He said, I go to church and no one understands my work. A lot of pastors are hammering social media. And in some ways, I think it's good to point out how destructive technology is on our society.
Mm-hmm.
And I think digital addiction is extraordinarily underrated as a very severe issue
Right.
societally and in our people as churches. So don't ignore that. We should address that. But to only address that when you might have someone in your church that is building technology that's part of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
Like we've had so many people say stories of like, oh man, I work at Meta. My pastor just keeps hammering Facebook. He's like, what am I doing the devil's work? Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. And I think to call your people to see themselves as people of God within those places to be sent there is a totally different mindset. And so I think just meeting a bunch of people in tech, realizing, wow, like there is a deep disconnect for many of them.
Right.
And then equally, and this all happened kind of 8 years ago, 2016, met all these great ministry leaders and pastors and struggling to understand, how do I use technology, build technology, how do I think about technology, and to serve my church, to serve my organization. And I was like, I can't solve anyone's problem, but if you guys all get in a room together, you're now starting to deal with all these issues in one place. So the builders of technology can actually educate the ministry leaders, and
Right.
they can actually build things for them that they need. And so FaithTech started as a small little coffee shop meetup in Waterloo 8 years ago. And then just people in other cities like Toronto, Vancouver were like, can we do that in our city? And I was like, I don't have a name for that. And then it just took off. I think God's had his hand on it. Fast forward 8 years, um, there's communities meeting around 50 cities now in 18 countries with a network. There's probably 15, 20,000 people connected in some way to just a deep desire to think differently on technology from a biblical, Jesus-centered,
Mm-hmm.
redemptive
Mm-hmm.
lens, to build technology fundamentally different than the way we are now, and to equip the church to train their people to think about this digital world in a gospel-centered,
Right.
Jesus-centered way. And we've seen some strides in that too, and that's been encouraging. But I think there's just a huge need right now for pastors and ministry leaders to try to, I think you can have the lens, Matt, of my calling is to my people. And what are my people? How do I get the best out of them that points them to the gospel? And how do I help them lay down their idols that's keeping them from giving glory to God?
Hmm.
And I think every pastor and leader knows how much technology is shaping society. I would argue it certainly has the most disproportionate influence of any industry I can think of in the world, even more than politics. And so because of that and its power and influence in shaping humans and how we communicate, how we interact, I think it's our responsibility as pastors and elders and ministry leaders to seek to understand a biblical framework of technology, which there's some great writing, great thinkers out there that are doing that work and trying to get that word out on what is God's view of technology, which we could talk about, but also to figure out, how do I equip those that are more tech oriented in my church to think creatively on how they can
Mm-hmm.
leverage their skills for advancing the gospel.
I love that you shared that story about that woman who was asked to do PowerPoint, because I remember the first time you told me that story, and that stuck with me, and I think it convicted me, because we had some tech people in our church, and I think I was obviously underutilizing them. I mean, there's times where it's like, man, we have nobody for PowerPoint. Who knows how to use a computer? But
Right.
but there is the reality of like, wow, how could we see this gift that this person has, and how do we continually try to come alongside them? We did vocational groups where people in different spheres of influence. Like I think another one where you're going to have, where people probably feel, I don't know if they feel shame. You would maybe know, like maybe some of those people feel a little shame about what they do for a job because of what has been said from the pulpit. But I know that,
100%.
right. But I know
100%.
other people have felt similarly about being teachers in the public school system
Mm.
in churches. And I remember I was speaking on how Jesus went to Samaria, and how he intentionally went there and
Mm.
met the woman at the well. And this teacher from a public school came up to me and said, the public school system is my Samaria. That's where I'm going. And she felt empowered through the message that she needed to remain where she was. So I think the comment is a beautiful one. James, we've had some people on the podcast that have talked about using social media, Instagram, Facebook, recognizing that it's probably more like healthy eating than getting off of it completely. Like the world in which we live are interacting with social media. I think for lots of people, it's an extension of themselves, right? They give updates like I remember the first time I heard someone say, "Hey, I was just on vacation, everyone." They provided a status update. "Sorry, I wasn't on giving updates over the last week. I was on holiday." And I felt like, what a strange thing to say. Like, I wasn't certainly sitting here wondering why I hadn't been posting over the last week. Like, but
Though,
you
Matt,
may have been.
I was waiting. No.
You may have been. But what's interesting about what you're talking about
Mm,
is you're not necessarily touching on here the application of how to use these technologies, although that is a part of the discussion, but you're interfacing with the people that are writing the code, that are doing the strategizing around how these things happen. Because you provide for us, for our listeners that would have no idea, what you're seeing as some of the most redemptive conversations in the background at Meta, the background at OpenAI, all of these different places where I'm sure believers who are working with these companies, and there is a redemptive hermeneutic that they're using to engage in their work.
mm-hmm. Well, this should blow some people's mind because it did when I heard it. At Google, there is the Google Christian Fellowship, and it has 3,500 people, probably more like 4 to 5 now,
Wow.
since I had that stat. And they have over 50 small groups that meet regularly across the world with a team, 2-person team that are on staff at Google that shepherd this community, that
Wow.
encourage them with different devotionals. They bring in speakers, and they can usually get any speaker in the world. 5 years ago, Google held a behind the scenes, no one heard of it. They got the most influential mega church pastors from very different backgrounds in a room together for 3 days to figure out, how do we partner together? How do we collaborate together?
Hmm.
And I remember hearing about that just after it happened. And I said to my friend who ran it, I was like, "You're the only human in the world I can think of that could have pulled that off."
Right.
Because if any one of them tried to pull that off, some others wouldn't go. But because Google held it, and people are like, "I want to be at Google. I want to," like, it has a power. Like, the craziness of that is, if I speak somewhere and you were like, "Oh, introducing James Kelly as an MDiv," boring, he's done this and boring,
Right.
and then you're like, "Oh, but he spoke at Google." People are like losing their mind. You're like, it's just a company, but the influence of this company is crazy. And so I think the cool part of that is there is faithful followers of Jesus that see it as their mission to spread the gospel and live out their faith radically within the most influential companies in the world. So Google has thousands of people, thousands of Christians. Apple has Apple Christian Fellowship. Facebook has Meta, Christians at Meta. That's led by a gentleman in Austin, Texas. I know, they do events, they do small groups, they're doing gatherings. They will do prayer walks around Mark Zuckerberg's office. And they have epic stories of just like a big group of them just bowing their heads in front of Zuckerberg's office, and he'll just like chat with them and say hi sometimes, and they'll just do like prayer walks across the office. Now, on one hand, you could be like, "That's cool, that's faithful, like, I love to see that." Is it changing things? Is I'd say, maybe, what's the fruit of that? And I think in one way, it's hard to tell, because of, I guess you could try to understand if the whole company's changing. But sometimes too, like, my Bible study last night, we were studying in John all about when Jesus says, "I'm the true vine,"
Hmm.
and bearing fruit.
Yeah.
And when you look at that, though, like, the goal isn't the fruit bearing, the goal is remaining and abiding in Christ.
Yeah.
So anytime I'm with these leaders of these amazing, big tech company Christian groups, there's like faithful obedience, guys. Like, God, that's our goal
Hmm.
with this. And so that's kind of big tech. And then there's cool stories we get to hear of small new tech startups that see the way faith tech is building technology and says, we're going to start our company starting with this method. And the method includes things like lament at the start of a technology company, or before you go build a tech tool, do a process of lamenting the problem, like really feel your role in the
Mm,
problem you're solving, and asking questions like, what's the role of the Holy Spirit in coding? You know, like, yeah, that's an important question. Or when do you reject technology as the
right.
solution to your problem? That's a really big one too. And so that's even something too, I think a lot of pastors are starting to struggle with the emergence of AI and, chat GPT and tools like that, where, these are phenomenal tools that I'm, typically uh, approve of, in a sense of like, we need to use these tools to a
Hmm.
certain extent. But if it becomes a go-to of like, oh, like the process of wrestling with God through a text is more valuable than any summary statement or
Right.
research you can get
Right.
based off the tools. And so I think there's deep value in those tools, but the order to which we use tools is sometimes just as important as the tools themselves. And this is where I think when you're trying to understand the word, or trying to get prepared to teach somewhere, or leadership lessons or things like that, the order to which we do it and provide the spirit space early on, I think is super important. So a couple tangents in there, Maddie, but
Hmm.
we got to share that there is movements
Hmm.
of Christians in some of these very influential places. I would just encourage anyone listening that is more on the Luddite side, like, you know, um, technology is destroying society. I would first say I think there's partial truth to that, and I would affirm that. But I would say the primary posture then should be to pray for the believers in these spaces
Right.
before hammering the technology as destructive for society.
Hmm.
Because I think we want to see those believers thrive in their calling in these places.
Hmm. Maybe you could speak to a story of someone within the tech space that is feeling empowered, um, and not necessarily celebrated, but they are seeing that what they're doing is meaningful, and maybe they now have a meaningful relationship with their church community, where their church community has arrived at a place of going, yeah, like how can we come alongside you, encourage you? And maybe it's no different than, the average person that has an average job. There's just a uniqueness, obviously, to the way that technology fits into our daily life, as you're saying.
Yeah, there's some cool stories, I guess, individual stories that I get to see more in Waterloo, where I am. So we have a regular community that meets regularly here that I'm a part of. And I think it's just early on in Faith Tech, I tried to say, hey, I'm going to go to all these churches and try to teach them. Like, there's this cool, rich theology of technology. I think it'll help you as you equip your people. And then you just quickly realize, like, the best way is for those that are part of churches to be equipped to educate their church and
Right.
educate their pastors and their leaders. And so, those are stories we now have got to see over years
Hmm.
where, we'll equip, there's guys I'm thinking of now that have been able to go and meet with their church elders and pastors and say, hey, there's this book on a theology of technology. I'd love to just explain it to you. Or, I'm thinking of one guy who, got to sit down and actually train his church on how to think theologically about technology based off of, learning and being a part of tech community for Jesus. And
Yeah.
so I would say that's the other thing too. Like, I know a lot of people listening, Matt, are pastors and ministry leaders, and that is a source of learning. Like, go out for a coffee with a tech person, tech leader, software developer from your church, and ask them, hey man, can you like help me understand this? It's a complicated world and you're in it all the time. And maybe we could learn together on a good, rich, biblical, gospel centered way of understanding the digital technology world that is
Hmm.
radically influencing all of us. I'd say like that journey over like in isolation, go do all the research would probably be far more life giving as well.
I think we could probably have 3 podcast episodes or more on the theology of technology, but you've used that term and that phrase, which I'm sure for you has like a background rich meaning. It's probably like when Tim Keller says, the gospel is simple enough that a 4-year-old can understand it, yet when you're 85, you're still, haven't totally gotten to its depths. But when you talk about a theology of technology, could you give us just an overview of what you mean by that? Because I'm sure you've also had people that have integrated themselves into the faith tech community who came with what they'd say is like a theology of the world, and then a light bulb went off for them as to a theology of technology.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, overall, from my study and very early in the world of faith tech, when this started happening, I had no idea. So I just started reading Genesis and asking God, like, what do you say about technology and using technology in its broadest sense of a tool,
Mm-hmm.
something that can, like language can fall into the definition if you look at it broadly. So I just started looking through like what does God say about different technologies and systems and tools. And one conclusion I came to is God views technology both as idolatry and opportunity. And so on the idolatry side, there's many examples biblically where we take a tool or a thing and we prioritize it above God. And I think a lot of ministry leaders, pastors are more equipped to talk about that side of it. A good example is like a classic example is like Tower of Babel,
Yeah.
right? It's like such a
Bitumen,
cool
mortar.
story. Rick, like that's the thing that kicked that story off is like, we got this new technology brick. Let's build something to the heavens. And God's like, well, wrong posture towards me leveraging that new technology. But then you get cool stories on the other side of the story of Noah is really cool to me. God's like, okay, I'm going to give you this advanced technological blueprint to build this thing in the middle of nowhere where for years everyone's going to mock you. And it's going to be a vehicle, not in and of itself, but it's going to be a vehicle towards redemption. And Noah does it, and you're like, what is this guy doing? And there's this example of technology serving a deeply redemptive purpose in God's narrative and story arc of humanity. There's many examples like that. And I think actually a really other powerful one is the cross, Matt. So you look at the cross, this is the most advanced technological method of bringing suffering to humanity that the Romans could come up
Mm,
with. And they were using this tool of wood in a particular method, a particular way
yeah.
that was then crafted and used with death and suffering in mind. And what happens? Jesus comes along, who, as a craftsman, most certainly would have worked with wood, takes this symbol of death and this tool and technology of suffering and redeems it. And then the cross becomes a symbol of hope, joy, love, redemption.
Mm-hmm.
And it redeems this vision and tool of suffering and literally redeems that symbol, that tool. I think that's just like a good example of, we need to be very cautious in the arena of technology being idols and all the way down to like super practical stuff of rhythms in our life and Sabbath and turning technology off. Like you can turn the internet should be turned off. Our internet turns off at 10:30 every night. Hopefully we're in bed before then, but if it's not, we can't even go
Yeah.
online. So super practical stuff like that. But then on the other side, I think we underappreciate how much biblically technology is used. God uses technology,
Mm-hmm.
advanced technology, to share his gospel at a unique time to unique people continuously throughout his word. And so I think we must continue to do so. with the technology we have now.
Well, and you would imagine that it was part of his created purpose, that he, creator God, creates beings in his image, in
Mm-hmm.
which he says, go be creative, like go subdue and harness. Essentially, I believe what's going on there is harness the raw materials of the planet and make something beautiful. Like they were intended to spread out, to scatter, to build the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, and to utilize raw things, which some of our raw things in the tech space is now the use of computer and code
Right.
and all these sorts of things to make
Yep.
beautiful things, beautiful expressions. What are you seeing as some of the most redemptive uses of AI technology? I had a conversation maybe a couple months ago with Joanna Lafleur, and she talked about, the ways that we're already using AI that we don't even think about it, like the everyday uses on our phone. Like we get a calendar notification. It's like that's a form of artificial intelligence. It's reminding us of something that we put in there in the past. What are you seeing as some of the most redemptive elements of technology? I can think of ones that I was watching a Bill Gates documentary not long ago, and he was talking about the ways in which we could start using some AI. But from the stories that you're hearing, what are some of the most exciting uses of AI that you're hearing about?
Man, we're actually in 2 weeks. So in April, we're running a course called Redemptive AI.
Great timing.
Great timing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But by God's grace, actually, we have like
Mm,
educators, teachers from like Google DeepMind coming, and professors from like God's just blessed us with some really, really smart people. So I would say they probably have amazing stories and theology they could teach. But like one story that's coming to mind, Matt, was the origin of this was in the early days of FaithTech in Vancouver. We ran a hackathon. And that's a new word for anyone. That's a retreat for geeks. It's
yeah.
amazing. So you take a weekend or a short period of time, 2 days, 3 days, and you say, how do we take a problem in a very short period of time? You build a solution to it using
Yeah.
technology. And the idea is to accelerate the process. And it's very, very, very fun. So we're running a hackathon, and this lady shows up at the beginning, and she goes, look, I know you guys are a room of 40, technology people. God's called me to help women get out of sex slavery in Vancouver. She said, here's a problem. Every woman I get out, another woman goes in because the demand's not changing. And let me show you some. She pulls up on the screen in front of everyone. She searches how to buy sex in Google. I'm like, where's this event going? What have we gotten into? And she proved to us the first result was here's where you go to meet up and buy sex. And she goes, look, I don't know what the solution is here, but all these men, the demand has to change, and all of them are going online to find this. So someone digitally aware has to help solve this problem. So this team buys the website howtobuysex.org. And the idea, and we have a similar story around suicide prevention, but the idea is that you move up in the rankings, right? So, they win the hackathon or something like that. Like, it was really cool, but I was like, this is actually going to work. It's not going to work. Well, this team then, they realize, actually, what if we put ads on escort websites to just talk about sex with people? And they're like, do you want to have a conversation about sex? Was their ad. And they had so many guys reach out. They quickly built like a triage technology tool that would ask automated questions, just 2 or 3, to triage who actually wanted help and who's just like, oh, forget it, I'm moving on to the next thing. Now that already is AI
Wow.
kicking in. Then they were actually able to have one-on-one conversations with these guys, start partnering with men's ministries. These guys form a nonprofit. 2 of them are full-time at it. It's called Buyer Resist, because there's so many guys that are online and using technology as vehicles to in many cases destroying their lives and in pain and hurt, and finding vehicles to which they can live that out. And so these guys are now finding all these really creative ways to use
Yeah.
AI to actually help guys and lead them into real conversations still with other men to get help. But there's tools you can use AI like that along the way to make substantial impact. So that's one of, by God's grace, many, many stories like that, where really Jesus-centered people are that really understand this world are seeking out redemptive ways to use it. So praise the Lord for guys like that.
I want to finish a little bit, James, with a bit of where we started, which was, you had this big picture over, the pockets of where God is moving and working in different parts of North America, the world to some extent. I'm wondering if you could do your best based upon the information that you have to look forward 10 years from now. What are you hearing from God? What are you studying practically every day as you're having conversations? And as part of that, what do you anticipate? And then how can we as followers of Jesus walk, prepare, intentionally build to be prepared for that day?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things came to mind pretty quick, Matt. I think one is, well, God gave us some language a year and a half ago where our purpose now for FaithTech is to see a Jesus revival awakened in and through technology all over the world. And revival, I mean, whatever word you want to put in there, it's an unexplainable work of the Holy Spirit
Right. Yep.
in and through technology all over the world. And so that's led us to a posture of faithful obedience to whatever comes next, which is, it's very counter tech, which is constantly looking like really far in advance. What's the trend so we can kind of get behind it? And we've just kind of really started leaning into like the faithful obedience of what's right in front of us and walking in that. And so that's what makes answering this a little more challenging, is I would say being very present is foundational to like a moment when we're not present. So I'd be doubling down on that. Yeah, I would say those just around some trends. I do think that, as we enter into this world of hyper questioning everything, like the issue right now online is not around, deep fakes and AI, is not so much around this image is fake. I'm questioning whether that image is fake or not. The deeper issue has become real things being questioned. Meaning like
Okay.
reality is now like, if you send this online, someone could go, that didn't actually happen. Matt and I didn't have that. That conversation is all
Right.
AI produced. And you and I are like, no, no, no. Like I was there. That actually happened.
Yeah.
But with the emergence of AI, now reality is questioned. And because of that, my hope, less than a prediction, my hope is that it moves us towards seeking authentic reality, things that we can know, we can feel and touch and experience. And so I do think you're going to see a wave of people that are hungry for in-person, real, tangible experiences, because the further you go down the virtual path, the more empty it will get if it purely becomes virtual, because God designed us as humans for embodiment and to be present with each other and to receive a hug and to see tears in our right in front of us. And so my hope is, because of this emergence of virtual, we'll actually see a reversal into embodied spirit. And I think that's what equips the church really well. I think a church can still look to do digital, and how to do that well is important. But the church is called foundationally to look local and to serve the people in front of them. This is why I say it's nice having a faith tech community, because they can work together with all the different churches to serve the
Right.
city as like a technology think tank innovation hub. I think local churches need to just be like, how do I serve the physical people in front of me, and really double down and do that exceptionally well? I think that's what people are going to be more and more hungry for in the future. And so my hope is that that happens and that's true. There's some others, but maybe I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Well, James, we'll have to get you back on. This is
Love you,
probably
man.
it'd be good, like for an annual thing, to get
Yeah,
all
let's
the
do it.
updates on what's happening out there. But I really appreciate your insight, the story that God is writing. The first time we met, this faith tech thing wasn't even a reality, so it's been a privilege to be on the front lines, courtside, to this
Yeah, man.
incredible journey. So keep going.
Hey, before we close, I got to interview you, because I think anyone listening is probably like, well, hey, hold on. what's Matt's story? Like, we got to hear more about your story and get someone, getting you all the hard questions here. So, if anyone's going to do that, I'll raise my hand if at any
Yeah.
point. I said at the beginning of the podcast, I was like, could I just turn this whole table on you? Like, people are going to be far more interested to hear your story. Can I turn the table? And then I was like, oh, but that's also dishonoring maybe of all your prep work and everything too. So anyway, if we could pull
if we
that
get
off,
some
if you're
listener,
open to it,
if we get
that
some
would be
listener
cool.
feedback on that, let's do it.
Everyone get the thumbs up going. We'll automate thumbs up, get it to like 1 million.
Yeah.
It's all good. We'll make that.
Oh man, you're awesome. My brother,
Love you,
thank
man.
you.